My name is Kay. Welcome to ArtBookNook, where I share my fantastic collection of art and craft books with you. Before we look at the book itself, it's worth explaining briefly what exactly Notan means and why it's relevant to all of us as aspiring artists. Notan is a design concept from Japanese art that focuses on the harmonious relationship between light and dark shapes within a composition rather than detail or colour. As viewers, we naturally read large shapes and patterns first before we notice any detail. Notan helps us understand why we're instinctively drawn to some images while others just leave us unmoved. And although Diane works primarily in oil and pastel, this way of seeing applies across all media: watercolour, oil, pastel, acrylic, collage, print, and it's just as relevant for representational work as it is for abstract pieces. So, today I'm sharing The Art of Notan by Dianne Mize, an artist's guide to painting light and shadow. And if you're not already familiar with Dianne's work, I'd really like to introduce you to her. She's an exceptionally talented artist and teacher, and I've learned an enormous amount from Dianne over the years. If I could give her a big hug, I absolutely would. So let's begin. Painting is a visual language shaped by light. Light allows us to see, while shadow gives form and meaning to what we observe. For that reason, one of the most important questions an artist can ask is, what is the light doing? By focusing on light and shadow rather than detail, we begin to see and paint with greater clarity. Here Dianne introduces Notan in its simplest form. By identifying where the shadows fall and giving them a single value, we create a clear pattern that shows exactly what the light is doing, and that pattern is the Notan. The key is learning to see where the shadows are. Once we can do that, everything else falls into place. So there are just two areas we need to consider: shadow and not shadow. Dianne's book guides you through recognising those shadow patterns, creating a Notan, and then using it as a foundation for your paintings. The word Notan comes from Japanese and refers to the relationship between light and dark, or positive and negative space. It's an idea that's been part of visual design for centuries and is often illustrated through the yin and yang symbol, showing the balance and unity between opposites. Here Dianne shows how Notan can be used to understand light and shadow in realistic painting. By focusing only on where the light is hitting a scene and where it's being blocked, we create a simple shadow pattern. Sometimes this is referred to as shadow mapping. Everything begins with identifying the light source and its direction. So in this example, the light is soft and overhead, so the shadows are minimal and stay close to the forms. And Dianne explains how light behaves when it moves across a form. Surfaces that face the light catch more of it, while planes that turn away receive less and fall into shadow. She makes a clear distinction between form shadows, which describe the turning of a surface, and cast shadows, which occur when one object blocks the light from another. Understanding this difference helps us simplify what we see and make clearer decisions when painting. Dianne encourages you to let go of recognising the subject altogether and focus only on what's in shadow and what isn't. So using the horse as an example, she shows the difference between form shadow, where the surface turns away from the light, and cast shadow, where the light is physically blocked. The Notan records the overall pattern of the shadow shapes, not their value or detail. And it's this simplified shadow map that then becomes the foundation for a painting. Dianne will now show us two simple ways of creating a Notan by looking only for shadow shapes. Rather than drawing objects, Dianne works methodically through the image, identifying and connecting the larger shadow masses. The aim is to keep all the marks a similar value, so the pattern stays clear and uncluttered. To do this, Dianne is using a Tombow brush pen. These come in black and several shades of grey. However, a Notan can be made with any brush pen or pencil. The important thing is to keep all the strokes as close to the same value as possible. It can feel a bit awkward at first, but with practice, the eye begins to recognise shadow as the subject and not the things creating it. Individual shadows often connect into much larger shapes, even when they appear separate at first glance. A Notan helps us recognise and record those connections. Diane makes an important distinction here, that a Notan is not a value study. It isn't about recording multiple shades and tones, but about capturing the overall pattern of light and shadow. Light and shadow work together, and neither is more important than the other. As we move around a scene, or as the light changes, the Notan pattern will change too. The subject stays the same, but the structure of light and shadow changes. A really useful exercise is to make small repeated Notan studies. This helps train the eye to recognise the shadow patterns and build a visual library that you can return to when painting. Here Diane demonstrates creating a Notan using a watercolour wash rather than a pen with a single value, such as the Tombow pen. When working with a wash, there's a natural temptation to introduce variation in value, but the aim is to resist that and keep the shadow shapes as even as possible. Whether the shadows fall on the form or are cast onto the ground, they all belong to the same dark pattern within the Notan. A Notan can begin anywhere there's shadow. So here Diane starts with the sheep's rear, where the shadow shape is easiest to identify, and then she pieces the pattern together across the scene. What's important is that the wash doesn't change, even though the actual shadows in the subject may vary in value. The focus stays firmly on the shape, not tone. Diane chose to work from a photograph with an unusual viewpoint, but a very effective one nonetheless for studying light and shadow. It did make me smile though, as it reminded me of my old border terrier Bracken, whom I've sadly lost. Every time I tried to photograph him, he'd turn away at the very last moment, and I ended up with hundreds of photos of his bottom. I didn't think you'd want to see that, so I've shared a much nicer photo of him. In Chapter 2, Diane explores how light behaves, whether it's direct or diffused, and why that matters when we're working with light and shadow. As artists, our aim is to learn to distinguish what the light does to various parts of the scene. Is the light dispersed light, or is it direct? What is the angle of the light, and where is it coming from? What is its source? Diane uses a simple bell pepper to show how Notan changes as the angle of light changes. In each example, she places the Notan alongside the photograph so we can clearly see how the light and shadow pattern has been recorded. In the first image, the light is coming from above and slightly behind the pepper. We can tell this because the top is lit and the cast shadow falls forward towards us. The Notan captures that entire light pattern, where the light rays hit and where they don't, without worrying about surface detail or value changes. As the light source shifts position, the shape of light and shadow change, even though the pepper itself stays the same. And this is why focusing on what the light is doing, rather than the actual object, makes it so much easier to see the shadow shapes clearly. And notice the difference between the shadow patterns again here with the same pepper. Top left we have direct light, bottom left diffused overcast light. Under overcast outdoor light, the position of the light source doesn't really change. The sky becomes the light source, so the light comes from above and is more evenly dispersed. Shadow edges become softer, cast shadows are lighter and contrasts are reduced. Values sit closer together and colours appear less saturated. Diane encourages you to compare the degrees of value contrasts in this old dead tree with those of the flowering tree on the next page. I will put the two images side by side for you to make it easier. In this photograph, Diane breaks light down into centre light, halftones and shadow. Understanding this structure helps us read form clearly before colour comes into play and will help you produce the Notan. And here it is. And Diane explains where the light sits in relation to a value scale. The lightest light is called the centre light. The point where the form moves out of light and into shadow is known as the terminator, and everything between the centre light and the terminator falls into the halftones. So the light side or light part of a Notan represents this entire range, from centre light through to the terminator. And a value scale will help us translate those halftones into our paintings. Rather than thinking in numbers, Diane prefers to think in much simpler terms, what is in shadow and what is not. This might sound a little complex at first, but if you invest in your own artistic development and spend a few minutes with these pages, I think you'll have a real light bulb moment, just as I did. And I've put links in the description of this video below to where you can buy a copy of Diane's wonderful book. The only difficulty with identifying halftones in this way is that not everything sits in direct or diffuse light, and for that reason Diane suggests thinking of halftones in two categories. Some are predictable, those we see under direct or diffuse light, and others less predictable, such as the lighting conditions shown in the photographs on the right-hand page. Diane reminds us that while theory is a useful aid, it's always better to trust what our eyes are actually seeing, rather than forcing an image to fit a rule. Using simple spherical forms such as these pumpkins will make it easier to see how the halftones change as surfaces turn away from the light source. Even flatter forms like leaves follow the same logic depending on how they're positioned towards the light. So just a reminder, the halftone sequence always begins with the lightest light, and as the surface turns away from the light source, those halftones gradually darken, even though the object hasn't changed. The Notan won't actually show those subtle shifts, it simply tells us which areas are receiving light. The value study then breaks that down even further, and then a colour study helps us decide how the colour sits within those values. So that concludes Chapter 2, How Light Behaves, and we now move into Chapter 3, where Diane explains how shadows behave. Shadows are simply areas that don't receive any light, and in this image of leaves you can see just how much of the scene actually sits in shadow. There are two main types of shadow. Form shadow occurs as a surface turns away from the light, and cast shadow is created when one form blocks the light and throws a shadow onto another surface. If this is all starting to feel a bit too technical, don't worry. You don't need to memorise these terms. What Diane is really doing is giving us a way to understand what our eyes see instinctively. Just being aware that there are different kinds of shadow, like there are different kinds of light, and that's enough for you to start improving your work without overthinking it. Both form and cast shadows consist of various value areas, and we can learn to read those. We see all of them in this photograph of a sheep in the backlight. And now Diane will show us how to identify these by using a value scale. We'll begin with the occlusion shadow, which is the darkest, and in this scene it's the area between the sheep and the ground. Without it, the sheep would appear as if it were floating, therefore it's essential to include this in our painting. Connecting to the occlusion shadow is the deep shadow, and as you move your eyes upwards to round the tummy of the sheep, notice how the value gets a bit lighter. When painting landscapes, we also need to consider how aerial perspective affects light and shadow. As forms move further away from us, they tend to become lighter, softer and cooler in colour. Once again, Diane reminds us that the key isn't rules, but observation. When we learn to really look for these relationships and read what's actually happening, our paintings begin to take on a new life. Atmospheric effects in a landscape such as mist, fog, rain, smoke from fires, other weather conditions, and even the time of day or year all influence what we see. We call these atmospheric effects, and they also affect how the shadows behave in a scene, because they change the values of both light and shadow. And that concludes Chapter 3. So in Chapter 4, Diane is going to show us how to use Notan as a value structure for a painting. She has shown us how to prepare a Notan and will now explain her process for every phase of getting from the Notan to a finished painting, using the image of the old boat in overcast light. This is actually a really good choice because there are no strong cast shadows here to rely on, which would have made things much easier. So it's a really good example of how Notan will help when the light is softer and more subtle. In overcast light, the value range will be much narrower, so Diane used a more limited value scale to reflect the pattern of light and shadow she can actually see in the photograph. She also makes the important point that she didn't take this photograph herself. Working from photographs taken by others will always have limitations, and nothing really compares to actually being physically present in the scene. By squinting and allowing the details on the photograph to blur, the light and shadow pattern becomes much clearer. You can see how the light sits on the upper areas of the boat and the grasses, with everything else falling into shadow. Diane begins with a preliminary sketch, and then she plots the Notan over it. But she doesn't treat it as something that's fixed. She keeps responding to the actual scene, which in this case is the photograph. Diane then applies the Notan using a simple wash. Gamsol for oils, water for acrylics, and a very light wash on damp paper for watercolour. Diane finds ultramarine blue works particularly well here, as it's not staining and won't interfere with later shadow colours. From this point on, the Notan becomes the underlying pattern for the painting's value structure, and begins with a simple block-in, placing only the main value and colour areas. When Diane sets up her palette, she mixes a single colour from light to dark, creating a clear value range. She will explain her setup in more detail a little later on in this book, but for now she just wants to introduce the value structure she's using for this painting. So we've got in shadow, transition and not in shadow. The darkest shadows are occlusion shadows, shown in the image top right. In painting, these are often called accents, small but very important areas where the light is completely blocked. Next come the deep shadows, followed by the terminator, which is the transition where shadow turns back into light. If this all sounds a bit complicated, it honestly isn't. Owning a copy of Diane's book and working through her explanations is where these concepts will really fall into place for you. Certainly did for me. And here Diane introduces you to a method she loves for getting a value range of colour. Many artists refer to this as a value string, but Diane prefers the term value line. So rather than constantly mixing different values as she paints, she prepares them in advance using a limited palette of colours, so the value structure stays consistent throughout the painting. On the right-hand page, Diane illustrates the 4 values from left to right, dark to light, for the limited palette she's using for this study of the old boat, and has placed her Notan value scale above for your reference. In Appendix 1 at the end of this book, Diane provides you with a detailed step-by-step guide to help you set up your own value line palettes. Diane begins by blocking in the main value and colour areas, starting in the shadows and keeping everything loose. Squinting helps her to ignore detail and focus on the underlying value structure, especially in overcast light, as the values sit very close together, so comparing one area directly against another is the best way to judge them accurately. Before blocking in the lighter areas, Diane squints and compares the shadow values, looking at how strong or subtle the contrasts really are. Only when the canvas is covered entirely with paint does Diane consider the blocking phase complete. So from here, the painting moves into refinement. The Notan has done its job, guiding the placement of light and shadow, and now it's time to have some fun and enhance those values and bring the subject to life through texture and character details. From here, Diane adjusts values if necessary, adds texture and strengthens contrast where needed. The Notan holds the painting together while the final details bring it to life. And here is Diane's beautiful finished painting. And when placed alongside the reference photo, you can see how the Notan guided the values rather than copying the actual photograph itself. In Chapter 5, Diane shows you how to take the light source from one photograph and apply it to another. It's a fun and practical way to learn how changing the light can completely alter the mood of a painting. You could also apply this idea to your own photographs. For example, turning a scene from an overcast dull day into a hot sunny afternoon with strong shadows. First, Diane sketches out the barn she wants to work with. Then she creates a Notan, but instead of keeping the original overcast light, she imagines where she would be standing and uses the photograph with strong sunlight as her reference. By doing this, she is able to transpose those shadows onto the Notan and completely change the light in the original scene. To convey the new light source, Diane sets up her palette using colours from the photograph with direct sunlight, arranging them into simple value lines from dark to light. She then follows the Notan and begins by blocking in the shadow values, establishing the painting's overall value structure. At this stage, the focus isn't on detail, but on placing the right values in the right areas. Working this way and using the Notan as her guide, Diane avoids guesswork and stays clear about what belongs in shadow and what belongs in light. Diane now blocks in the areas that are not in shadow, using the lighter side of her value lines. She keeps these slightly more controlled than the photograph, knowing that camera light often overexposes highlights. So rather than copying the photo, she adjusts values so the light still reads convincingly in paint, even on reflective surfaces like the roof. Throughout this stage, the Notan continues to guide her, keeping the value relationships clear as the painting continues to develop. Diane treats the blocking as the foundation of the painting, focusing only on light and shadow rather than detail. She works across the whole canvas until it's fully covered, letting the Notan guide the value structure. This stage is also a chance to step back and check the composition and fix any issues early on before moving on to the refinement. Finally, Diane cautions against what she calls the image trap, paying more attention to what we think we see rather to the underlying values. And with that, the main teaching portion of her book comes to a close. In the epilogue, Diane shares her own journey as an artist, and it's both honest and very encouraging. Despite having painted since the late 1950s, yes, before most of us were born, Diane didn't fully understand the principle of Notan until around 30 years later. And for her, it was a true eureka moment, and thanks to Diane's teaching, the penny finally dropped for me too. The remainder of the book is packed with practical resources, including clear appendices on setting up a value line palette, using a traditional colour wheel, getting to know your tube colours and lots more. So I'll let you enjoy these pages, accompanied by some gentle music, and I'll meet you at the end with my final thoughts and details on how you can learn more from Dianne Mize. So we're now coming to the end of Diane's incredible book. So thank you for spending the time together with me. If you want light and shadow to finally make sense in your paintings, and you need a clear, structured way to build stronger paintings right from the very start, this book is well worth owning, and I return to it again and again. It teaches you how to really see light and shadow rather than trying to copy what's in front of you. And Diane explains Notan in such a clear and practical way that even complex value relationships finally make sense and click. She also shows you, step by step, how to move from Notan to a finished painting, and this will work across oil, acrylic, watercolour and pastel, and it will really help you to build the confidence you need to simplify your paintings and let the light do the work for you. This is the only book in my collection that has truly shown me how to actually use Notan, not just understand it in theory, but taught me how to apply it to create paintings where the light and shadow genuinely come alive. If you were to buy only one book on this subject, this would be the one I'd strongly recommend. I've put links in the description below to where you can buy a copy, and if you use those links, it really does help to support my channel, as I may earn a tiny commission. I've also linked to Diane's website, where you can see more of her beautiful work and explore her online lessons and courses. I've also linked to her comprehensive YouTube channel called In the Studio Art Instruction, which now has over 780 videos, and it's an incredible resource in its own right. Diane is not only an exceptional artist, but a generous and thoughtful teacher, and I'm incredibly grateful to her for how she clearly shares what she's learned over a lifetime of painting. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed my review, The Art of Notan by the wonderful Dianne Mize, and I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please give it a like or a hype. It really does help YouTube share the video with other people who may be interested in learning about how Notan works. And if you'd like to see some more reviews of some fantastic art books, you'll find plenty more for you here on the channel. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. It really makes my day, and I do read and reply to everyone. So until next time, happy painting.